as far as I've looked, and I know of people who've looked for 20 years now who are sort of feeding me information, nobody has a single reported evidence that any bacteria or virus, isolated and purified, has ever caused an animal or a human to be sick. It was very clear, and that's why Pasteur on his deathbed said, the germ is nothing, the terrain is everything, because he could not prove that the germ did anything, and he actually admitted it. So then we're talking 1890s, and they're starting to look at these different diseases, and some of them they couldn't find bacteria. So they had a light microscope, and the main one was polio. So they look at the brain and the spinal cord, people were paralyzed and dying, and they couldn't find any bacteria. Never mind that was also when they started spraying with lead arsenic, which is a specific neurotoxin for the brain and the anterior horn cells of the spine, exactly the part that causes paralysis. So they ignored that and then postulated that there must be something smaller than a bacteria that we can't see. And so they called it a virus, out of the old word for poison. And essentially, it's not a new concept then, but that's where it came from. We can't see it, but that must be it, because that's how diseases come, because there's some invading organism that got in you and is eating your nervous system. So they attempted to prove it. So they would take people who died, children or other people, grind up their brains, or take the spinal cord, grind up the spinal cord, and they would have this essentially glop of diseased brain and spinal cord like in a blender. And they didn't purify it because they didn't know how to purify it. They didn't know what they were looking for. And they would feed that to animals. Nothing happened. They would then inject it into animals. Nothing happened. They tried 10, 20 different animals or something like that. No animals got sick. And then they came to an interesting conclusion, which they still say to this day. Well, it turns out there's no animal models for polio. Just, right. Because it doesn't work like that. So you could confuse people and say, I know it works with people. Mind you, you don't try it with people because that's unethical. They did try it in 1918 with this flu pandemic. They had people cough at each other and breathe into each other's mouth, and they couldn't get it to transmit. So that was one of the only times they actually did do it with people. The rest of the times, and to this day, they say these viral diseases are hard to study because we can't find a tissue model or an animal model. In other words, we can't make tissue or animals sick. We can't do it on people. So one could say, well, how do you know it does make them sick? And anyways, they don't have an answer for that. But so they were convinced that it did. And so they eventually proved it by the following. They took a child who had polio, paralysis. They took some of his diseased spinal cord, put it in a blender, didn't purify it, didn't isolate anything. They took 2, I think, rhesus monkeys, drill a hole in their brains, inject about a half a cup of this unpurified stuff into the monkey's brain. One monkey dies, the other gets paralyzed. They hold the monkey up and say, see, we've proven that polio is contagious. And when you hear that, which I did, you think, you gotta be kidding. Like, first of all, they didn't even do a control. Like, what happens if you just drill a hole in a monkey's brain and put a half a cup of milk in it, or saline? Maybe that brain herniates down, and it kills the monkey. Or maybe it herniates and it causes paralysis. You have no idea. That's a superstition. And that was the proof to this day that polio is an infectious disease or a contagious disease. So then we go on into the 30s, and then they invent what's called the electron microscope. So they can take dead stuff, they can take tissue, and they can fix it and kill it. And they saw these little bodies inside tissue, and more of them when the person or the animal was diseased. And like finding the light microscope in the bacteria, this was their eureka moment. See there's this thing in your tissues, and especially if you're sick, you've got more of them, and those are called viruses. You can see they have genetic material in them, and that's what's making you sick. We found it. I mean, okay. So next step is they then they find them everywhere. They find them in sea algae eventually. They find them everywhere. Every living thing in every tissue has these bodies inside them that have genetic material, and more so if you're sick. But again, I would caution people, just because something is there at the site of sickness doesn't mean it's causing the illness. Just like there's firemen at fires, it doesn't mean they're causing the fires. So they then did what they should have done, which is they ground up tissue, filtered these so they only collected purified virus. They exposed animals to them in the normal way, like breathing it or drinking it, exposed some people to it, and over 15 years, none of them got sick. They were not able to transfer any disease with these purified viruses. So virology at that point said, yeah, we're done. This doesn't work. Viruses, we don't know what they're doing there. They seem to be something made by the tissues, which we now know they're called exosomes. When you poison the tissue, it packages up its genetic material and excretes it as a way of communicating with other beings through a kind of resonance, and we can get into that something has happened. So it's specific to the kind of poisoning, and it has this sort of resonance quality. It's the mode of rapid evolution. And that's why we know that poisoning a tissue, fear causes the tissues to make more exosomes, all kind of electromagnetic fields, a lot of things. Anything that's a toxin makes the tissue make more exosomes for very good reason. It's the method of detoxification. And they said these things can't make anybody sick. The field of virology was dead. They were going to become plumbers or something. And then this guy, Embers, comes into it. And he says, I have another way to show that these viruses cause sickness. So I take somebody with like measles. I take their snot. It's got these particles in them. And I put it on a tissue culture, like an egg, or skin cells, or cancer cells, or monkey kidney cells. And I put it on there because the viruses will infect the tissue, make more viruses, and then I'll show that it can kill the tissue. Doesn't work. Doesn't kill the tissue. You can't even kill like skin tissue in a culture dish with viruses. So then he says, I can do some manipulation, and I can make it easier for the virus to kill the tissue. I mean, frankly, so much for the killer virus, right? You can't even make a hamster or a tissue sick. So what he does is he says, okay, I'm going to starve the tissue, deprive it of the nutrients it needs to grow. And then I'm going to add antibiotics to it, which are toxic to the tissue, so that at least makes sure it's not bacteria. And then I'm going to put bleach and other oxidizing agents in this tissue, so that will weaken the tissue and allow the virus to grow in the tissue. And sure enough, it did. So the virus, the snot, with this starved, weakened, poisoned tissue, produces a whole lot more of these particles, some of which are the same particles from the snot. Now, if you think about that, you could say, how do you know that these particles came from the original snot, or the so-called virus in the snot, and not because you poisoned the tissues, because we know that if you poison any tissue, you will make these particles. And they didn't do a control. They didn't take snot from somebody who didn't have measles and see what would happen then. That now has been done. It turns out it kills the tissue in exactly the same way, because the thing that was killing the tissue is that you were starving and poisoning it. It had nothing to do with the particles in the snot. You do get different particles depending on what you start with. And that is the way they do virology now. They take somebody who has a cough in China, they take their snot, they put it in a tissue culture, they don't purify it, they just put it in a centrifuge, they inoculate that onto tissue, they starve the tissue, poison the tissue, it creates all these copies of these packaged poisons, and then they do a genetic analysis of this final product and say, see, we found all this stuff, and it's because of the original snot in the virus. And then they take this final product, again, don't purify it, don't filter it, don't isolate it, they admit they don't, they slit a hamster's throat, a bunch of them, squirt this down the hamster's throat. Some of the hamsters, nothing happens. Some of them get sick. Some of them get a cough. Some of them get a rash. They don't do a control. They don't slit a hamster's throat and just put saline down them. And they say that proves that this coronavirus is causing COVID-19. That's the proof. And because it has all this genetic material of a never isolated, purified virus, so you don't know where it's coming from, so the test becomes completely meaningless. And that's where we're at today. And that is the exact procedure on how they essentially prove viral causation. And the interesting thing about this, there's an honest virologist out there named Stefan Lenka, who said, I'll give anybody, I think it was 10,000 euros, if they can even prove that the measles virus exists. And he did that original experiment where he took he commissioned a group to take the frozen measles virus snot, and he did a control. And they got this exact same killing of the tissue. And the German Supreme Court ruled that there was no scientific evidence that the measles virus even exists. It's a figment of the process that they essentially collect viruses. And what has happened, because it's so astonishing for people to hear this, and what are all these virologists looking for? And the only way I can really explain this, it's like somebody says to you, I want you to make a Lego castle. So it's a brilliant castle. It's the castle of King John III. Okay, you got to make this castle. It's a magnificent castle. King John III, 1306. I don't even know if there was a King John. Probably not. Well, let's just say. And so here's all the pieces of Legos there are. Throws them on the table. And I'm going to give you $1 million to spend 2 years making this castle. So the first thing any normal human being would say would be, can you show me a picture of the castle? Or at least what it looked like. No. You can't see the castle. So you'd think to yourself, well, how am I going to make this castle? Anyways, the guy gave you $1 million. So forget about that. And so you start looking. And you find a moat. And then a window. And you say to yourself, well, it's a castle, it must have a moat and a window, so this is a part of the castle. So the analogy, you find pieces of genetic material, You don't have a blueprint for what it's supposed to look like. So you start piecing it together. And then somebody makes a discovery, I found a moat. And they give you a prize of $20 million to keep looking. And eventually you find moats and walkways and stuff. You don't know where it came from. And you start piecing it together to try to come up with a computer model, and then you add in the rest of the pieces. And then you say, here's what the castle looks like. And I have 20% of the pieces of it here, which is about what we have of this so-called virus. I have 20% of the pieces that must be from this virus, because that's what they said about the previous one. And so, oh, that's interesting. And some of these injected into the cells and et cetera, they find all these things that sound really ominous because they're looking for them. And only to find out, you say, I think this is what the looks like. And then the guy who originally started this says, oh, by the way, King John didn't have a castle. And that's really where we're at. And I know it's going to be hard for people to think, how could this possibly be? But from actually looking at the science and the studies over and over again, that's what happened.